Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quite rapid talk through about landslides. I haven't got 128 slides.
Yeah.
So don't panic. So I've had two presentations, so I'll just stick to the first one. I thought I might have enough time, so I thought I might do two, but I think I'll stick to one. If it's okay with you? Yeah? I thought so, yeah. I thought so. Okay, so landslides. So what essentially is a landslide? So a landslide, generically, is the downslope movement of soil or rock under the influence of gravity, basically. So it can be soil, can be rock, can be a mixture of the two, can be debris, but basically they move at a variety of different speeds. So we want to essentially look at different types. So why do slopes fail? Slopes tend to fail because you have to imagine that they are essentially under the influence of gravity at all times. So you have this driving, we term a driving force, which is trying to move the slope, gravity, and we have a resisting force, which is trying to keep the slope where it is, and that really comes down to the slope strength. However, you can have some external factors that can cause the slope to fail. Things like if you shake the ground with an earthquake, if you load tons of water, that can cause it to fail. If you decide to cut the bottom of the slope, which sometimes we do, or sometimes if you build on top of a slope, that slope can often cause it to move. So there's a whole series of these factors which can cause a slope to move. So all slopes you see are under the same situation. Some are not moving and some are. So very simply, this sort of diagram illustrates the issue. So here we have a block which is on an inclined plane. We have gravity acting down here, W, okay, and then basically it's a combination of forces acting on that block to either pull it down the slope. So here we have a component of gravity which is trying to drag that down the slope, and then we've got a resisting force acting against it, trying to keep the block where it is. You've done that, so if you take out a block, put a block on there, and if you tilt the block, okay, the block will stay where it is. Then at some point, the block will then move, and there's a triggering angle at which that block will slide. And so it's those balance of forces that we want to look at. So here again, so we have this, like I said, this threshold angle of stability. Basically, you keep going to a certain point, it'll be stable. If you go over a certain angle, and then the slope will fail. So it's those balance of these forces. But it's slightly more complicated by that because we've got inherent strength of the slope. And those, we measure that to describe that using these terms. So we use what's termed the shear strength. So when slopes normally fail, they do a process called shearing. And so to prevent shearing, a slope has these inherent strength conditions. The first is friction. Okay, we term the frictional angle of a slope, and then some internal strength, something called cohesion. So all slopes have cohesion, and all slopes have friction in them. And those two things give or measure to give a slope a certain amount of strength. And so most slopes will be resisting movement because of those inherent properties of the material. Here's a little diagram showing you that. So here's a slope. I'll just describe the different components. So this slope here is going to fail along this surface, and we call that the failure plane or the shear surface. So basically this block is going to slide down that way. We have gravity acting down. Okay. We have what's termed the normal stress, which is acting into the plane. Okay. We have the shear stress, which is trying to drive the block down the slope. We have the shear strength, so that's cohesion and friction, acting to stop that taking place. And then we have an additional factor, which is called pore pressure, which is water, which is acting against your normal stress. And so basically all those are acting together on the slope. If these overcome the strength, then basically your slope will stop. So we as engineers or engineering geologists, geohazards, will try to quantify that and measure the lag to try to understand how stable the slope is. So there are normal things we sometimes term angle of rest. We use friction angle. So normal materials will sit happily at a certain angle, but then if you get more than that, then they will fail. So here you can see a squeeze slope about 45 degrees. You've got sand here. Again, we'll have a normal angle. We'll be stable at a certain angle. Again, inherent in these friction angle parameters. And here you've got a volcano and a sand dune. Again, all stable at certain angles. But if you go beyond that, they start to become unstable. So again, it comes down to these friction angle and also cohesion. The role of water, though, is very important. It's by far the number one cause of slope instability. Okay, excluding earthquakes, but in the UK principally. So essentially, the water enters the pore spaces here, acts through capillary attraction, called suction, can actually increase the strength of the material. But as you add more and more water and you fill the void spaces, basically the pressure of the water forces the particles apart, and then you lose strength of your material completely. Okay? And this is called pore pressure. Okay? So when someone tells you that water lubricates a slope, water does not lubricate a slope. There is no such thing. It's the pore pressure acting that reduces the strength of the material. So here, if you've got dry sand, if you get wettest, moist sand, you get a really nice sandcastle. If you add too much water, it liquefies and it becomes a slope. Yeah? So exactly the same concept. So pore pressure, okay. So pore pressure is calculated really by unit weight of water times by the depth. So the more water above you, the greater the pore pressure exists at that point. Okay. If there's no water, there's no pore pressure. Okay. If you've got lots of water, you get lots of pore pressure. So you can see if you have lots of rain and your groundwater level is rising very high, therefore you're going to get greater pore pressure, and therefore your slope is going to become unstable. So unit weight of water times the depth gives you the pore pressure. And that's quite an important measure. We want to know what groundwater is, because that has a major influence on the stability of the slope. So again, back to this figure, pore pressure here acting against your normal stress. Is it acting against those particles in the material? You've got gravity, you've got your shear stress trying to drive it down, then you've got your shear strength trying to keep your slope from moving. So you've got all these balanced forces, things trying to move, things trying to resist, and so your slope, whether it fails or not, is a balance of all of those processes. So in terms of landslide types, we classify them really according to the material that's moving, but also the mechanism of motion. So there are three different types. There's falls, flows, and slides. We're going to focus on flows and slides. And basically they can involve either rock material, pure soil, or a mixture in what we term debris. The movement is normally down and outwards. What I mean is it goes down and then spreads out, okay, towards the top. So advanced classification, there are lots of different classification types, but this is just a simple one. So material types, like just pure rock, debris, soil. Type, is it falling or toppling, is it rotating? So you do it by type of motion and also by type of material. And that's how we tend to classify the landslides. In most cases it works. It can get a little bit complicated when you've got some complex style movements. I want to show you some nice videos that are probably not quite as exciting as Fabio's, but this is a nice photograph of a landslide in Japan, Route 168, and illustrates the impact of landslides on roads, etc. They knew it was going to happen, so they basically partitioned it off. And those trees going past is not a normal occurrence. So here we've had essentially a big, what we term a planar failure. It slid along a planar surface, and those trees have slid along with that landslide. So the first we talk mass movement. One important distinction is what we term creep. Now creep is not a landslide. Creep is a type of mass movement because your slope is moving, and the reason we include it is it's a precursor. If you find creep, then when you find things like bent trees, you can see those trees aren't naturally that sort of angle. They're being tilted down slope. That is the kind of alarm bells going off that that slope is not stable. So creep is sort of a separate classification, but we use it often as a sort of a warning alarm bells that something may be occurring. So basically it's just where the surface, ground, is beginning to creep down slope and move, maybe a weathered zone, or maybe some sort of discontinuity. And I've done work before, commercial work, where I've done mapping, and all I found, the only thing I found on site, were a series of bent trees. That's all I found. And then when they did the investigation, they found a really large landslide complex. So actually these kind of indicators are really very useful when you're looking at landslides. The first type of landslide we look at is a flow. Okay? So a flow type landslide is one where the slope fails through what's termed internal shear. So basically there's no specified plane, it just begins to fail and basically flow. So obviously with that you need to have quite a large amount of water present, and essentially it flows down almost like a sort of a viscous liquid. It can be quite slow, so they can be moving maybe a few centimeters per year through to extremely rapid debris flows, instantaneous movement. So here's an example here. This is actually from, I think, from St. Catherine's Point, Isle of Wight, we're going to go to. And you can see essentially here, you can see this flow here, okay, has flowed over, this mud flow here has flowed over into the foreground, and you can see here, you've got the toe accumulation of material. You can see that is like, essentially, just flowed, saturated, and flowed over that topographic feature. Debris flows here, the first graph from debris flows in Hong Kong, and you can see essentially started off as a rock fall, and then basically came down slope as a series of debris flows. If you look at the channel of them, you can often find the debris left behind, or the fines have been washed out. But again, you can see evidence of these quite large clasts within these debris flow channels. Here, this is Ticino, again, it's a very large debris flow. This is here to show you the scale of these features. So these are houses, you can see both the size of what we term the source area, the transportation zone, and then the depositional area. So really very large features, they can be massive and very, very active. Here's the sand flow, just a very small feature, but again, it can occur in different types of materials, not just in soil and debris. And then often they form, like here in the back end slide here, these big, long track debris flows, mud flows, which come part of much larger landslide sequences. Here, this is one, again you can see, again here, it shows nicely the source area, the big bowl-shaped depression here, track coming down, and then here in the foreground is this area of deposition which we call the lobe. This is a video taken from YouTube, it's in Afghanistan somewhere, but it's a very nice video showing a debris flow. So what's interesting here is to look at the size of the clasts and look where the largest clasts are. Okay? Normally you'd expect them to be at the bottom of your slide, but in fact you see they are being carried, they're being buoyed actually by the flow itself. see the large class essentially being carried on top of the debit flow as it comes down. Slides. So a slide is different. A slide involves a failure but along a predefined surface. So there's a preferential zone of movement along which the landslide occurs. And the first is a rotational slide. It's focused primarily on fine-grained materials, essentially clays and silts, and essentially you get a circular failure surface develops on which things begin to essentially rotate, which is the characteristic appearance of these landslides. The second is translational. This is what we also term planar. It's essentially the block slides along a surface which is parallel to topography. Okay. So again, this one here illustrates the difference between them. Is that what we term a graben develops here in the back of a translational slide which does not develop in a rotational slide. So here's a translational slide. So here, essentially what's happened here is the block here has slid outwards towards the sea. The graben here has formed behind. Well, it's in a half graben here. There is the scarp. So essentially this block is moving in a translational manner and essentially forming a graben behind. So the Bindon slide in Devon is a good example here. You've got what's termed Goat Island and chalk as it moved out towards the coast. Here is the scarp, and this big depression here is where the graben has developed. So this block here has detached and sliding out towards the coastline. Here's another photograph of it. Shows Goat Island, which is a detached block. It's really large. You've got the scarp as the starting point, and this chasm, which is the graben, has developed as that block has slid out towards the sea. Other translational landslides don't have to be in temperate environments; can occur in arid environments. Here, a translational slide has occurred here in the Sierra Leone. You can see here a scarp developed in that translation map, essentially between the overlying regolith and the underlying rock material. Here, a slide in Loess deposit from Kyrgyzstan. Again, you can see quite nice translation motion here as the Loess has felt over the underlying bedrock. Again, the houses are here to scale. The second is rotation. So what happens here is that the blocks detach, but then they begin to rotate. So I thought we'd photograph that. Yeah, here we go. So basically, you've got the scarp, the big break off, they rotate backwards, and you get some rotational motion occurring. So here's an example. It's actually in the UK, quite a small scale one. We can see, first of all, what we term the arcuate shape of it. We can see this block here is settled down and rotated backwards. Here's a better example. This is in France, near Grenoble. Students of the scale. Here's the back scarp. You can see there those trees are. And here you can see this block here has slid and rotated backwards. You can see that those trees are no longer vertical, but are in fact tilting backwards in response to that rotation. The next type of slide, which is quite unusual, is termed a mudslide. And a mudslide differs from a mud flow in that you have to have this shear surface developing, which is quite unusual to find in mudslides. This is in North Italy, but it shows some quite nice characteristics as this has essentially slid as a block rather than flowed like a mud flow. So it's quite unusual. You don't see this very often. I've only seen a few of those in my time. Now, although I talk about different classifications, there's flows, there's slides, In most cases, most landslides exhibit one or more of the different types of motion. So you'll see a rotation and you'll see flow. So here, good example here, black fen again, exhibiting lots of different motion, lots of rotation, lots of flows. So basically all of them are essentially moving in tandem and responding to each other. An unusual one which is called spreads, which is essentially where you have a weak layer, and essentially perhaps after some shaking what happens is the weak layer begins to move, and essentially a series of horse and grabens as that material begins to move on very low angles. It can be very, very low angles indeed. Here's an example here. This is I think in Canada, and you can see here this very flat line material here has essentially liquefied and begun to move out as a spread. So it's quite a good example. In the UK, we are affected by what's termed solifluction. So solifluction is, or was, the movement of material downslope under periglacial sort of tundra conditions. As the ground was freezing and thawing, you got big sheets like this developing, moving downslope. In the UK, we still have remnants of these, and these cause us some very particular problems. So from a UK geohazard, there are many cases where the remains of these have been reactivated as a result of basically people, road construction, etc., causing quite particular problems. So although we're no longer in post conditions, where we've got these deposits left behind, and they have caused us some quite major problems. And a little caveat is, I always say, is the relic landslides. So what I mean by that is, when I mean relic, I mean quite old landslides, the ones that have what we term moved under a previous climatic regime. Okay? So they're really old, they're very degraded, and they're really hard to find. Okay? And if you miss them, then you're going to have a real problem. So here, it's one of our field trips. When we came down here, there's a hospital at the bottom, and it had the largest anchored wall I've ever seen. Massive. Big, huge wall, lots of massive anchors in there, and couldn't quite understand why. So you come back up the slope, and then look back across, and you can see why. It's basically the toe of a huge landslide complex, which is slowly moving down slope. But it's very hard to see. It all looks like green fields, yeah? There's no fresh scarps, there's nothing, but you have a landslide complex there which is moving and having quite a major impact. So I always caution the lecturer with saying it's not the fresh ones you've got to worry about, it's the old ones that you can't see. Yeah? It's those ones that relic in the landscape you've got to try to identify. If you look carefully, you can see them. The characteristic thing here is the fact you've got a series of benches. Can you see these benches here? Okay. You've got essentially a scarp in those trees, and you've got quite a lot of undulating fields. So there's some evidence of motion there, but they are quite difficult to find if you haven't trained yourself in how to spot. I often get asked, what does a failure plane look like? So I've got a landslide, it's moving on something, but what does one look like? So to see one's quite difficult. You've got to dig into it, or sometimes you're lucky enough to be on a coastal section where you can see a failure plane. So this is a failure plane here. This line here you can see here is intact London clay versus London clay that's moving off along that shear surface. And a shear surface is very interesting. A shear surface, we find it, is polished, so it's really smooth. It's glayed, so it's got a blue discoloration because of the reorientation of the minerals. But you can see how smooth this surface is. It's beautiful and smooth. You often get lineations, like slick lines, forming along them that give you a sense of motion. Here is again quite an undulating surface, but again, hopefully you can see how smooth that surface actually is. Here you've got glaring and slick inside, you can see this blue discoloration here, and you can just make out these lineations on the surface in response to the motion of that top bit moving on the lower undisturbed underclay. Here's a close-up, really pronounced, you can see it. But again, in most cases, you don't see that. You only see it in normal conditions. If you come and dig a troll pit through it, you may encounter those in a landslide, but they're quite difficult to find otherwise. Also, what we term lateral shears, that's the edge of a landslide is shearing as well. And here, this feature here, this line, is a lateral shear, as this bit of the landslide is moving towards the students, and this bit of the landslide is not. So it's shearing along the side, as this bit is moving downwards. So you get basal shears, shear surfaces, as well as lateral shear surfaces. Here's a good example here. That's a pillbox that was probably on top of the cliff at one point, but is now moving down. You can just see the lateral shear here, going down here, and this block is basically floating, that pillbox is floating on top of this debris flow, and moving down towards the coast. You can use that to date the landslide. If you know how old, when that pillbox is installed, look at the air photographs, you can roughly estimate how quickly that landslide is moving, if you were that interested. So that's landslides in what we term soils. So that's landslides in normal slopes. When we move on to rocks, they differ significantly. And the reason is because of this. So a rock, if you look at a rock mass, or it's a rock mass, a rock slope, is crisscrossed by lots of what we term discontinuities. So those are weaknesses in your rock mass. So things like, got a slide here. Oh yeah, bedding planes, shears, foliations, schistosity, folding, got gulls, joints, faults. So any fracture, or we call discontinuity, in a rock mass could be a potential plane of failure. So you may have done this, but what we often will do from a geohazard perspective is we'll try to quantify and measure those discontinuities. Okay? So things like we look at the orientation. Yeah? We try to measure the roughness of them, how rough or smooth they are. We try to measure the size of the blocks, aperture, how open are they. We do lots of measurements of this to try to then help us understand how that rock mass will behave. Okay? And we can do some analysis looking at data which helps us understand if a rock slope will fail, and if so, how will it fail. So here's a scan from, this is actually a laser scan we did a while ago, but it's quite nice. It's in Hunstanton. It's quite unique. It's got the red chalk here alone, but you can see clearly the rock mass is cut by loads of discontinuities. Bedding planes, you've got discontinued joints, more bedding planes, joints. So you can see it's crisscrossed by all these. And what you can see is that that is controlling how the rock is behaving. So this bit here has failed, okay, and the material on the beach is really being controlled by those discontinuities. Not only them, how they interact with each other. Very important. So the first type of landslide is what we term a fall. So a block detaches from a rock face and simply falls under gravity downwards. Free fall of moon under gravity, it's very rapid and typically involves some sort of near vertical cliff and is controlled by discontinuities basically, so, as I've already said. So they can fall vertically, they can bounce a bit, they can roll, they can do all sorts of things. If you search on YouTube, you'll find some videos of some blocks doing some really quite amazing stuff. So although these are nice round cannonballs, most blocks are not. Most blocks come out in some sort of tabular fashion, so as they start to spin, they'll do all sorts of quite interesting things. So they can be very destructive. Here's an example of rock fall. Can you see where it's come from? Yeah? You see its source zone? Yeah? So this block and these blocks have come from there, haven't they? Yeah? And basically it's slid out and then falls down. So you might say, it's not really a problem, is it? It's not really a problem. But if you look the other way, there's a house. Yeah? The house gives you gives you an example of size, so you see how close that is to that house. So have major repercussions. And what they've done is they've built an earth bund around, you can just see here, around the houses to try to deflect those blocks as they come away. Because that's going to happen again. It's going to be you can see quite clearly that that rock mass is going to fail again, and so they need to do something about it. My favourite picture, if you live in that house, you're going to go, whew, blimey, that was a close call. Yeah? And you go, oh, that's not pleasant. Yeah? So it's come to rest literally just outside your front door. So those detached from a cliff, vertical cliff further up, you could just see the edge of it here, and then came rolling down that slope, and then came to rest by this person's house. This is my favourite video. And I'll tell you one in a second. Is it working? Okay, I'll have to skip that. Debris falls sometimes happens. I was walking along here, it's in Villaville, northern France, and literally, as I was walking along, people were running out of the house with furniture. And I was like, that's a bit weird. Is that how people move here? But literally, they were literally running out, carrying furniture. And you couldn't understand it. And then we walked further down and realised why. Because the previous evening, there'd been a massive rainstorm that had dislodged some overlying material on top of this chalk, which had come down and completely destroyed some of the houses. And so they'd been ordered to evacuate. So they were evacuating as quickly as they could. So in this case, the debris fall is fallen vertically onto those houses. Planar slides. This is in a rock mass where you have a planar surface. That's what's termed daylighting. Daylighting means it's sticking out of the surface. Okay? It's visible. It's daylighting. It sees the light of day. So therefore, if it's sticking out, then basically you've got the potential for a slab to move. What it also needs is what's termed release surfaces. So it needs to have surfaces behind and to the sides that allow the block to be released and to slide down. Okay? And there are a whole series of different types you can have, but essentially it's a slide down slope along some sort of discontinuity. Here's an example. Okay, we can see people for scale. So here are some guys on ropes, and here's a drilling rig. What they're doing is they're trying to drill in, putting some anchors to try to stabilise the slope. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, but can you see the problem? Can you see that Can you see these lovely planar surfaces daylighting here? So this slab is daylighting here. These slabs are daylighting. So essentially, the main concern is this slab is going to break off and slide this way. So since then, they've come along and done a tunnel. So basically put a massive tunnel through here to try to keep this road open. Here, this is the Clap de Luke slide. Again, you can see here, a really big failure here, okay? And you can see the rock apron that's been produced from that slide. So really massive. Here at Down the Valley, they basically had a big lake form, which basically produced, you can see here, these lovely sort of flat alluvial plains formed from those lake deposits. Wedge failures are unique in the sense that you get a block core formed from two intersecting joints or discontinuities, and this little sort of rhombohedron then just slides off and slides out. I haven't really got to be first of that. I have, but it's not in my presentation. And then toppling. Toppling is quite unusual. It occurs where you have a really big rock mass with essentially vertical joints like that, and then the block that's there just gradually goes and just falls out. Okay, so it's quite unique in the preparatory conditions, but basically it can happen. Oh, I hope this one works now. Oh. Okay. So I'll show you. There are different types of topples. There's this what we term monolithic, which is a big tall block which just falls out. That's called a monolithic failure. But you've got more flexural style, where you've got these vertically embedded and they begin to sort of flex out. They can occur. So here's an example. It's a pit in Shropshire for my colleagues. And if you look above the students, can you see the dip of the bed is actually distorted? This we can see it. Yeah. So, and that's a result of this flexuring that's occurring in these. And essentially, you can see at the top that basically there's like a stack of cards that are beginning to move out towards the cliff. And you can see the further you are towards the face, the more displacement that you can see on those stacks of blocks as they begin to rotate out. And again, you can see them here in the entire quarry. The slope is essentially moving out into that rock face. So I'd be a bit cautious to why we're letting students in that, don't we? It's not good looking. Oh, my best. Okay, so that's landslides. So I've gone through quite rapidly there. So I think I'm actually slightly early. So,